comes from the Gospel of Mark, and there we read, "As Jesus taught, he said, 'Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation.' He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth 1 penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on.'" Let us pray. May your words only be spoken and your words only heard, and we do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. Well, if ever there was a sermon that was going to get me into trouble, it is probably going to be today. So let's jump right in. Kids sometimes say the darndest things, and that's because they're honest and they're innocent, and so sometimes kids will ask when they see me, maybe it's the first time they've seen me, they will ask their parent and they will say, "Mommy or Daddy, why is that man wearing a white dress?" Because this looks a lot like a dress, doesn't it? And if I was the only person on a Sunday morning who was wearing something like this, if there was nobody else anywhere else who wore something like this on a Sunday morning, people would probably think this was crazy. This would probably make people feel uncomfortable. It would not seem normal because this wouldn't fit what's normal for a man in our society, our culture, to wear. The thing that makes it normal is that lots of people do it. There's a lot of churches across the country and across the world where a whole bunch of guys are dressed up in white dresses. And so since so many people are doing it, that normalizes it. And there's actually a name for that. It's something that's called the normalization of deviancy. Now, deviancy doesn't mean corrupt, but it just means not the usual. So numbers, either numbers of people that do something or the number of times that an event is repeated, tend to standardize, normalize deviancy. And social constraints, that's because social constraints shape our behavior. And so numbers reflect social constraints. And these constraints tend to influence. And so something that would be crazy for an individual isn't crazy for a group. Or is it? We think about the normalization of deviancy, we think of how that, and we think about the power of social constraint. It certainly exercises force through religion, right? I mean, religion is one of the most powerful forces of social constraint. And religion is one of the most powerful forces in terms of normalizing things that otherwise might be considered deviant. And so some of you will remember, we're in Soundtrack, the stories and songs that shape our lives. In this particular sermon, we're going to focus on stories more than songs. Virtually everyone here, everyone past a certain age will remember November 18th, 1978, when a man named Jim Jones asked his almost 1,000 followers to drink Kool-aid. It wasn't actually Kool-aid, it was grape punch, laced with cyanide and Valium. And they did, and they all died. 276 of them were kids. And so what would have looked like an aberration for an individual drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid because a group did it suddenly was normal, and 900 and almost 1,000 people lost their life that day. And a phrase made its way into our culture from that, a phrase which we have probably all used at some point, and the phrase is drinking the Kool-Aid. And what do we mean by drinking the Kool-Aid? What we mean by drinking the Kool-Aid is when individuals that otherwise would say something is crazy buy into a group that believes a crazy thing, right? That's drinking the Kool-Aid. And so if we see somebody that has become a part of a group and we think that as an individual they think that was crazy, but the group they're a part of, they say, man, you're really drinking the Kool-Aid. And so, for instance, and again, I said if I'm going to get myself into trouble, I'll get myself into trouble. This is the sermon. But there are churches, all right? There are whole churches and some of the biggest churches in the area that don't believe women have the same rights and privileges as men. And there are churches that don't allow women to the highest positions of leadership. And what they will let women do is teach Sunday school, because that's what women do, right? They take care of kids. And so no women in high levels of leadership, but women teaching. Could that be, I don't know, as an individual, if you said, a woman's not the same, doesn't have the same rights, if you said that was crazy, but you're part of, could that be drinking the Kool-aid? Well, I don't know. You'd have to decide. But maybe. And one of the things that I love about St. Matthew's, and I really do, I love this about the Episcopal Church in general and St. Matthew's in particular, is that we have women in the highest levels of leadership, and we have men teaching Sunday school. It's a beautiful thing. Last night, Faith Factory, teaching Faith Factory. I apologize. And last night we had one of our young men, a guy with 2 young kids, a very busy guy, one of the manliest men I know, actually one of the strongest guys I know. He does CrossFit training, and he is an absolute beast. I mean, he's in full beast mode. And he taught Mike Long. Many of you know Mike. Mike taught Faith Factory his first time last night. And I thought what a beautiful thing that is, because think of what that says to a kid about what being a man really is. I mean, that's just such a powerful thing when men exercise some of those roles, like teaching our kids. Just such a powerful and beautiful thing. And so there's this story, the story of Jonestown. We get this phrase, drinking the Kool-aid. And then a date that all of us will remember was September 11th, 2001, right? And a group of people an action that as an individual would have seemed absolutely crazy because they were part of a group. Because they were part of that group, it made that action seem normal. And they flew their planes into the World Trade Center, and almost 3,000 people died. And between Jonestown and September 11th, 2001, those are the 2 deadliest events in United States history. What they both have in common? Religion. Religion exercising social constraints so that people drank the Kool-aid. Is it any wonder that so many of the people around us have a hard time with religion these days? But of course, it's not just religion that exercises social constraints. There are other forces that exercise social constraints. Industry. And the term normalization of deviancy really came to sort of be a well-known term through the Challenger explosion. Again, another story that shaped our lives. I can remember exactly where I was. I can remember exactly how I felt when I heard that the Challenger had blown up. And the Challenger is an example of the normalization of deviancy. They found, years before the Challenger blew up, an O-ring that deviated from what was acceptable by a large enough measure that the whole fleet should have been grounded. But because that flight flew successfully, flew another flight, and then because they had enough flights where it had this deviation, but the flights didn't crash, they accepted it as normal. Except it wasn't. And when that day came, the Challenger blew up, and people said this was imminently predictable, and the term, the normalization of deviancy, became forever associated with the Challenger, because industry can exercise those same kind of social constraints. Society certainly can exercise those social constraints. I said, if there's a sermon I'm going to get in trouble in, this will be the sermon. Society can exercise those kind of social constraints around sports. And sports in many ways becomes the new religion. And it's not by and large kids that are driving the whole sports things, it's parents. Because they want their kids to perform at a certain level, and they want their kids to stand out in a certain way, and it's just what everybody's doing. So we book our kids in sports, and everything else takes second place to that. Family dinner takes second place to that. Our kids' health takes second, and everything sort of takes second place to that. And I remember when I was in my last church in Florida, and there was a very elite orthopedic surgeon in that church. And he said, it's these parents that keep me in business. He said, because they drive their kids so hard that only the genetically elite are going to escape injury. He said, frankly, that's what's going to separate out the real high performers from everybody else. And he said, statistically, there's very few real high performers. Because once a kid gets injured, they're out of the game. They're never going to be as good as the guy who's genetically elite, who never gets injured, and therefore is never going to be held back. And so these parents are going to push their kids to be this person, which maybe 0.2% of the population is, which means the great majority of the people aren't. And all these kids trying to be that because their parents are pushing, they're all going to get injured. They're all going to end up in my office. They're all going to have blown joints. They're all going to have torn tendons. They're all going to have, I thought, holy cow, I never thought of that before. And so society can exercise social constraints, and it becomes awful easy to drink the sports Kool-aid. Families can exercise social constraints, and families can be one of the most destructive social forces on the face of the earth. And families, because families pass down dysfunctions like almost no other organization can. Families pass down addictions, whether addictions to food, addictions to alcohol, painkillers, whatever it is. If you are a person who struggles with overeating, you probably know that one of the hardest places to find support in a new way of eating is in your family. Because everybody in the family wants to eat the way they've always eaten. The systems want to perpetuate themselves. They don't want to change. And so, if a person tries to start drinking and their family loves alcohol, chances are they're not going to get much support in the family, because the last thing a family wants to do is for a person to stop drinking, because then they all might have to stop drinking too. And you get things like definitions of success. If I could just, you probably know this, but I think probably one of the single greatest sources of misery that I have seen in 30 years as a priest comes from people following family constraints in terms of what they consider successful. And so they pursued paths of success that they thought would make their parents happy or whoever happy or whatever, but it made people miserable. I could just tell you story after story after story after story after story who said success looks like this because that's what their parents told them success looks like, and that's what they pursued, and they said, holy cow, this is awful. Now, you expect me to say that? I say that a lot. I've been here 15 years. You've been hearing me say that for 15 years. So I'm trying to find other voices that say things. So if you quit hearing my voice, and I understand that makes sense to me, maybe you'll hear another voice. Now, I don't remember who said this, but what I remember when I read that is the guy sort of struck me as the anti-Rob. Very, very successful. I had all kinds of accolades. And yet he said this, and not a religious person at all. Very well socially accepted person, and this is what he says. You'll never heard truer words than these. He says, a lot of people talk about rising to our level of incompetence. He said, I can't say I've ever found much truth in that. What I find more to be the case is that we just tend to rise without thinking. In other words, it's not so much rising to the level of incompetence, just rising in general. We just rise without thinking. There is a ladder that exists in many career paths, and society brainwashes people to think that they're supposed to climb it. Not every new award, degree, or promotion is a good thing. And then listen to this, not me who's saying this. There are a great many ex-somethings floating around who would have led much more satisfying and productive lives if they had stayed in the trenches doing what they really enjoyed rather than moving in what looked like an upward direction. Ever heard truer words than those? I'll read that again. There are a great many ex-somethings floating around who would have led much more satisfying and productive lives if they had stayed in the trenches doing what they really enjoyed rather than moving in what looked like an upward direction. And again, I could just tell you story after story after story of neglected wives, of burned-out husbands, of children who feel abandoned. And I mean just story after story after story, because people unthinkingly took this idea of rising, and it was just the social programming. They drank the Kool-aid, took the bait, hook, line, and sinker, and that, yeah. And so we, and it raises then the question, if we have all these forces of social constraints, and all of these are good, by the way. All of them have the good points. Religion has its good points. Government has its good points. Industry has its good points. Sports has its good points. Families have their great points. But all of them equally, or maybe not even equally, but all of them also have the power to be incredible forces of dysfunction and destructiveness. And so the task becomes to think, to reflect, and to be able to weed out the good from the bad, from the stuff that's healthy, from the stuff that is anything but. And that's what brings us to today's gospel. And don't worry, we're not going to go on forever. I want to reflect for a moment on today's gospel, tell you a final story, and then we're done. All right? Reflect on the gospel, brief principle, final story, and we're done. So this brings us to today's gospel, because in today's gospel, what Jesus does is he pushes back against social constraints. And the way that you've heard this gospel always explained is most likely wrong. And I want to share with you how I've come to understand it. And this is only I first came across this interpretation 3 years ago. When I first read it, I thought, nah, it can't be. And I've thought about it, and the more I thought about it, the more this makes sense. And I think this is precisely what's happening. So most of the time we hear this story about the woman who put 2 pennies in. Jesus says, look at that, she gave everything she had. That's great, commending that woman. I don't think that's what's happening in this gospel at all. Because what we need to do is we need to remember the first part of the gospel. The first part of the gospel, Jesus looks at the religious institution of his day, at the religious professionals of his day, and he says, look at those folks. You know what they're doing? They're taking every last penny from the widows just to serve their own purposes. You remember that line? They devour widows' houses. Jesus says, what's happening is here, these folks are taking every last penny from widows who don't have it to give, and they're using it for their fancy robes. They're using it for the beautiful finery on their altar, and so on and so forth. And then, when a woman comes up and does just that, Jesus says, see, case in point. It's exactly what I'm talking about. And so he's not so much commending this woman as he is excoriating the religious institution of his day. He is scathingly brutal in his criticism of the religious institution of his day. And so let's go back to sort of where we started. We talked about men wearing white dresses, right? And so we might say, well, why does that guy wear a white dress? Well, originally, he wore a white dress because they didn't want people to be distracted by what the person was wearing under it. But in our day and age, if somebody hasn't been to church and they're not familiar with people, and they come into church and they see a guy in a white dress, they might say, ooh, what's he wearing that for? And they might say, oh my goodness, is that a cult? Isn't that the kind of thing they wear in cults? And that might make a person immediately feel uncomfortable, immediately distrustful, might immediately put their hairs on. And so a lot of people in the church today, actually the churches that have done the best job of addressing people say, man, that doesn't work anymore. See, they stopped drinking the Kool-aid. They said, why would anybody do that? They said, if we just wear suits, that's the professional attire that people are comfortable with. That gets the message across, doesn't put up any barriers, and so they just quit wearing robes. And, and so the principle is and it's fascinating. Jesus isn't so much participating in this morning's gospel as he's just stepping outside and observing it. And the principle is every now and then we need to work on things, not in things. Most of the time we're caught up in things. We use this in staff all the time. When we're caught up in our family, when we're caught up in our politics, when we're caught up in our religion, when we're caught up in our sports, we can't see the truth because we're caught up in it. And so every now and then we need to do what Jesus did, step outside and just observe. He's just watching. Just step outside, observe, reflect, and ask ourselves hard questions. Ask ourselves hard questions. Do I really need the latest, greatest, newest, bestest? You know, do I really need this? Do I really need so on and so forth? But some of the people I think speak the most truth in our day and age are the prophets of our day and age are stand-up comedians. And one of my very favorites is Louis C.K. And Louis C.K. can be absolutely perfectly foul, so you need to be warned of that. He'll say things you say, I can't really believe he just said that. Did he really just say that? But I don't know anybody who speaks truth more bravely than Louis C.K. And he's got a wonderful piece, and you can Bing it. I don't Google, I Bing. You can Bing it, and it's Louis C.K. on cell phones on Conan O'Brien. And because he's on Conan O'Brien, it's got the words cleaned up. But listen to what he says about cell phones. Man, holy cow. It's pretty profound. So, Jesus asked people to think, to recognize that in all of our social constraints, through the standardization, through the normalization of deviancy, we accept the good with the bad, and so we need to come and look at these things critically and say what's working, what's not. Embrace the things that are, celebrate the things that are, but have the courage to discard the things that aren't. And that brings me to my final story. It's a story I've told before, but I've been here 15 years now, and what I'm realizing is that not everybody has heard all my stories, and though this pains me greatly, that even people who have heard them may not remember them. So this is a story. For those of you who do remember it, I apologize, but maybe it's not a bad story to tell with some frequency. This happened on a mission trip to Belize, and you remember that we've said that we at St. Matthew's hope that everybody at some point in time will go on a mission trip, and this is some of the reason why. We were building a second story on a school, and it was just a ton of work. Remember that? It was, we would lift up those, it's so good to have you here today. We would lift up all these bags of concrete. They're 40 or 50 pounds. That's Elise Lintelman, who I'm talking to, and she lives over in Harrisburg, and we don't get to see her as much as we'd like to, but she was in Belize with us, so it's providential you're here today. That was a rabbit trail, sorry. And so these big bags of concrete, we had to take them up this ladder. I mean, there's nothing that physical labor for you. You had to do it all yourself. We put them on our shoulders, carry them up these big ladders. All these, I mean, we just spent a whole day lifting concrete bags. That we did a whole day lifting concrete blocks, getting all these concrete blocks up to the second floor. And then in the blazing hot sun and the humidity that the tarantulas loved, we would go up on the roof and we just worked from morning till night. And it was really hard work, but it was great work. At the end of the day, we'd come into the kitchen, and the ladies from the community who had a hard life, but were some of the happiest people we ever met. Why were they happy? They had great relationships. They loved each other. They worked together, and they just laughed and laughed and laughed and smiled and smiled and smiled. And we all thought, no matter how bad they have it, when you have relationships that good, you can deal with anything. And they made us these great meals. And so we would come in from working real hard, and they would lay these, and we would just devour them. And then we devoured the first course, and we think, oh, we're still hungry, and we'd devour the second course, and then we're still hungry, we'd have the third course, and that'd be all the food, and we'd think, oh, that's great, the ladies are happy because they see how much we enjoy the food. Until like the third or fourth day we were there, and one of the kids went out behind the schoolhouse. And it was getting dark, and they looked back there, and they saw one of the women with all the kids from the community back there, and she was feeding her kids crackers with ketchup. She was handing out a single cracker to a kid, putting a little ketchup on it and saying, here's dinner. And the kid realized we had eaten all their food. And they wanted us to have it because they were so happy we were there, but because we had taken more than we needed, more because we were in the habit of doing what we always do back here, we had actually eaten their food. And the kid who saw that came and told the other kids, and the other kids began to reflect on it, and they began to think. They began to stop drinking the cultural Kool-aid, and they began to say, oh my goodness. We do that at home. When we buy the latest, greatest this that we don't need, and we use all that money, we drink the Kool-Aid because this technology says you have to have it, when we've done perfectly well without it for whatever, we're taking the kids' food. When we buy 3 or 4 of this, when one is more than enough, and all of a sudden, man, the kid just said, holy cow, we've been drinking the Kool-Aid. You see, for all the ill that religion has done, there are very few things in our society that will check that impulse of social constraint if we let it. And it is so important that it does. Amen?